I want to wish everyone a good morning and welcome to Exodus Marching to Freedom. This class is a continuation of Rabbi Silber's ongoing course covering the first two books of Tanakh, a careful study of the story of Exodus, including the Paschal sacrifice, crossing the Red Sea, and the beginnings of the desert journey. For those who haven't had the privilege of learning with him before, Rabbi David Silber is the Dean and founder of Drisha Institute for Jewish Education. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. So we're having 5 sessions. In the past, and during this June, July, we didn't continue this particular series, but we decided this summer to continue. And we're going to pick up with, actually, even for those joining new, it's really a new chapter in the story of the Exodus. At the end of chapter 11, Moshe is speaking to Paro and warns Paro about the 10th plague, about Makat Becharot. And it sounds like Moshe is speaking to Paro, actually. For example, in the 4th pasuk of chapter 11, Vayom Moshe Ko Amar Hashem Kachatzot Halayla Ani Yotzei B'toch Mitzrayim. Moshe said, "Thus says God, at midnight I will go out throughout the land of Egypt," and describes the death of the firstborn. Sounds like Moshe is talking to Paro that day, basically. Tonight, something's going to happen. But then when you get to chapter 12, and we're going to pick up again with chapter 12, but when you get to chapter 12, then suddenly it sounds like we're going back in time, because the first pasuk of chapter 12 is Vayomer Hashem Moshe v'Aaron b'Eretz Mitzrayim le'mar. God spoke to Moshe and Aaron in Egypt. Achodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim. This month shall be for you the first month. So it sounds like the first month. It sounds like we're talking about the first of the month, or the day before the first of the month. But we're not talking about the night of Pesach, when the firstborn takes place on the 15th of the month. And then we go back in time. So the Torah, in a sense, is interposed. The command to bring the Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice, is interposed, actually. It goes back in time. And then the actual story of the firstborn, which starts by Hi B'Chatzi Halayla, which is in chapter 12, in the 29th pasuk, which picks up directly from what we have in chapter 11. That's 28 verses later. So the question is why, in fact, the order is strange. By that I mean it has to be understood why the Torah, in fact, has set it up this way. The Torah could have started with the Korban Pesach and the rules of the sacrifice, and then afterwards tell us what Moshe is saying to Paro just prior to the Exodus from Egypt, and everything would have been in chronological order. But a plain reading of the Chumash, simple reading of the Chumash, is not so. Therefore, it gives us pause or opportunity to think about perhaps why it's set up the way that it is. I didn't want to today talk somewhat about the Korban Pesach in general. Just make the point that the Korban Pesach, the way it's presented in chapter 12, and even I think earlier, one gets the sense that we can't leave Egypt until we first bring the sacrifice. That's what it sounds like. And in fact, in thinking about this sacrifice of the Korban Pesach in chapter 12, we are all reminded of the fact that during the entire conversations that Moshe has had with Paro through this negotiation that's taken place over the last few chapters, the one demand that Moshe has of Paro is that the people be allowed to go out into the desert and to bring sacrifices. These, in particular, they are for example, in chapter 10, it's olotus vachim. It's burnt offerings and shuabim, zvachim, which are sacrifices that are eaten by the ones who bring it. But the idea of bringing sacrifices, that's the one demand that Moshe has throughout. And Paro initially completely refuses to give in to that demand. Seems to be afraid they're going to run away. And at one point, Paro says to Moshe, because Paro keeps agreeing then and changing his mind. And at one point, he says to Moshe, you can bring the sacrifices, but don't go too far. That's around the time of the fourth plague. And Moshe seems to agree. So it would appear from that that Moshe's goal was not to immediately run away and to flee from Egypt. Moshe seems to have had a different goal. So the suggestion that I've made in the past, I'll make the same suggestion now, is that Moshe understands that before we leave Egypt as a nation, we came down as a family. We become a nation. But the idea of a nation, which is a collection of people who have something in common, and there's something in common, and Moshe wants to create within the people a sense of being a people, is that we all serve God. We are all servants of God. We all serve God. And before we can walk out of Egypt, there has to be some sense of that, because otherwise it's just a band of people. It's not a people. It's a collection of individuals. So the thing that brings us together as a people in the book of Exodus is people that serve God. This is actually a very important point, not just for the book of Exodus. Obviously, it's a central point. It's no accident that in the book of Exodus, which ends with the building of the Mishkan, at this Mishkan, this temple, is literally at the center of the camp. We all dwell around the Mishkan, and that's how this particular book ends. So a definition of peoplehood in the book of Exodus is people that serve God, people that are, and that's actually what God and Moshe have said throughout. The demand of Paro is a very simple one: Shalach ami v'yavduni. Send the people out that they may serve me. The idea that the goal is to be servants of God is the central idea of the book, and a central definition of what it means to be a people. This thought, this idea, emerges very forcefully in a different book of the Bible, which is the book of Shmuel. And when the people come to Samuel the prophet in the 8th chapter, and they ask him, Samuel is old, and they ask Samuel to find a person who will be king. They go to Samuel himself, and they want a king like all the nations. And Samuel objects to that. And part of the objection of Samuel, he has more than one objection to it, but at the core of it is what he says, not in chapter 8, but in chapter 12. He says, you have a king. Hashem Elohechem Malkachem. God is your king. In other words, what bothers Samuel is simply this, that a king, unlike, say, a judge, a shofet, that two pieces of what it means, two parts of the definition of kingship. One is that a king is a king of all the people. The king is not from a particular tribe. He may be from a tribe, obviously, but he has no special affinity to that tribe. A king is supposed to be king of all, and therefore he unifies the nation. If you attack one of us, you attack all of us. That's one idea of kingship, king of everybody. The judges were fundamentally tribal leaders. Sometimes they were able to co-opt or to reach out to other tribes. But fundamentally, they're tribal. And the king is a king of all. And secondly, and even more importantly, kingship is passed down from generation to generation. The judges in the book of Judges don't pass down their leadership. There's one situation where someone tries to become the next leader, Gideon's son. But apart from that, that doesn't work out very well. But apart from that, there's no dynasty. It's not dynastic. When it comes to kingship, though, it's passed down from generation to generation. So in theory, kingship can actually be eternal. No one king is eternal, obviously, but kingship in theory could be eternal. So what you have in the request for kingship is you have a kind of eternal institution, and not just eternal, but the king is the king of all. And that's what Samuel objects to, because an eternal king who's a king of all is actually God. And for Samuel, the very request for a human king is a kind of heresy, apart from the other objections to kingship, which is the king will abuse power. That's a separate objection. But the primary objection of Shmuel is exactly this point. And the book of Shemot that we're in the middle of is exactly that point. That basically the definition of peoplehood in this book of Exodus and the transition from family to nation, by definition, is, what do you mean you're a people? Well, we all serve God. So that's what Moshe wants before we can ever walk out of Egypt. There has to be some sense that, by definition, these are a people who are servants of God, who serve God. Eved is a servant, and the sacrificial servants is called avoda. Avoda. The sacrificial servants is avoda. In fact, later on in this chapter 12, we'll get to it, maybe not today, we talk about what's going to happen in the future, that our children will ask us questions. And one of the questions the children will ask in chapter 12 is, Moha avoda hazot lachem. What is this avoda? What is this? It is sacrifice, but what is this service? So the idea of avdut and avoda, that is central. That's why Moshe demands that we be allowed to bring sacrifices to God, but Paro refuses. And chapter 12 begins with the very first verse, Vayomer Hashem o Moshe v'yel Aaron b'eretz Mitzrayim lemor, that God spoke to Moshe and Aaron in the land of Egypt. And why does the Torah say the land of Egypt? After all, where else would God be speaking to Moshe and Aaron? But the point of the land of Egypt is that what previously was impossible to do in the land of Egypt, namely to bring sacrifices, because Moshe said to Pharaoh, we can't bring the sacrifices in Egypt, because that would not be looked upon favorably by the Egyptians. That would be an act which is a to'eva to Mitzrayim, an abomination to Egypt. We can't do that. They will stone us. That's what Moshe said earlier, and that was true before the 9 plagues. But by the time the 9th plague is rolled around, we're told that the Israelites and Moshe are very popular, to the extent that they're giving gifts to the Israelites, giving them golden and silver vessels, etc. That's the beginning of chapter 11. So what was formerly impossible to do, namely to bring sacrifices in the land of Egypt, now is actually possible. And my point is that the Korban Pesach that we'll be looking at in a couple of minutes, just thinking about the elements of the Korban Pesach and the Korban, is exactly what Moshe had requested all along. Moshe's request all along was, we want to bring sacrifices to God, but initially it has to be outside the land. And by the time chapter 12 rolls around, this is what Moshe had requested. It's not actually a new request. It's not even a request. That God says to Moshe and Aaron, in the land of Egypt, this is what you're going to do in Egypt. You're going to bring the sacrifice. So that's how we would, just one. I know I mentioned this in the past, and I wanted to begin with that thought. I think it's an important thought. That's number one. Point number two, about the great significance of the Korban Pesach, when we look at this chapter. So this chapter, this Korban Pesach, of course, it's part of the narrative, as I just said. We can't leave Egypt until we bring the sacrifice. But in the context of chapter 12, you have several other things that are very interesting. Namely, we have, for the first time, we've never seen this before in the Torah, we have a description of what it means to be a sacred day. Because the holiday, in chapter 12, there really are 2 holidays. Is what is called in the Torah Pesach. Pesach means the 14th of the month, that the day we bring the sacrifice. And following Pesach, there's a holiday of 7 days that the Torah calls in this chapter Chag HaMatzot, the festival of Matzot. And in the context of Chag HaMatzot, there are all kinds of rules that are given. There are also rules about the sacrifice. But on top of that, the Torah will say later in chapter 12, in our chapter, that there's also, that these days, the Chag HaMatzot is a Mikra Kodesh, is a sacred day, a sacred occasion. For example, in chapter 12, verse number 16, Uvayom Harishon Mikra Kodesh, Uvayom Hashiviyi Mikra Kodesh Yelochem. Kol Mulacho Lo Yaseh Bahem, Ach Asher Yeochel L'Chol Nefesh, Hu Levado Yeyoseh Lochem. So the Torah says in verse number 16 that the first of these 7 days of Chag HaMatzot and the seventh day, the last day, the first and last days are Mikra Kodesh. In other words, they are sacred days. During the 7 days, one is not permitted to eat chametz. That's the previous verse. One eats matzah the 7 days and not chametz, but from the first day to the seventh. But the first and the seventh, in addition, are Mikra Kodesh. They are holy days. And what does it mean? They're holy days. So it means primarily, Kol Mulacha Lo Yeyoseh Bahem. You're not permitted to do work. The Torah has an exception, that which is necessary to the preparation of food. What the Talmud calls Ochel Nefesh is permissible, but apart from that, Malacha is actually forbidden. The idea of a sacred day, the idea of a holy day, one might say that sacred time. So this is obviously, and this is really the first commandment given to the Jewish people. The Talmud thinks that even prior to that commandment, in the very second verse of chapter 12, that this is the first month, this is the first month of your year. The year starts now, in the month of the Exodus. So the Talmud construes that verse. It's not the plain reading of the text at all, that there's a mitzvah to declare the month, to declare the new moon. That's derived from this verse. Also related to time. The idea that you can determine when the month starts, because the month can start on one of two different days. The moon can be seen on one day or the next day. And depending when the moon is seen, then you go to the court, and the court declares the date to be the first of the month, Rosh Chodesh, which is not the plain meaning of the text, obviously. But even there, it's about time. But when it gets to Chag HaMatzot, it's not just about time, it's about sacred time. So here we have really this particular commandment about the Korban Pesach, which is the first commandment to the Jewish people. It's about having your own calendar, but it's also about sacred time. So the Korban Pesach actually is about sacred time. That is the Korban Pesach and the 7 days that follow, Chag HaMatzot. But it's also about sacred space, as we'll see shortly, because the Korban Pesach on the 14th has its own particular rules that are described in chapter 12. And I wanted to look at those rules and to discuss them, and really to get a sense of the great significance of the Korban Pesach, because as I said at the outset, we can't leave Egypt until we bring the Korban Pesach. And that idea that you can't leave until you bring the Korban Pesach is fairly explicit in chapter 12. And let me find that verse. The Torah describes the way the Korban Pesach is to be eaten. The Korban Pesach was brought on the 14th of the month, but it was eaten at night, which is on our calendar, the 15th of the month at night. Okay, let's assume that the day starts at night. Okay, so then the following night, we are to eat the Korban Pesach. And the Torah, there are all kinds of rules about how one prepares the Korban Pesach and how one eats the Korban Pesach. Let's find that verse.
Could you let me know where to find it, and I can put it up on screen.
It's in chapter 12. I just want to find this. It's here it is. It's verse number 11. Verse number 11. Chapter 12, verse 11. After it describes the way the Korban Pesach is to be acted out. In other words, how does one perform this ritual of the Korban Pesach? How it has to be roasted, for example. It can't be cooked. It can't be left over. That's in verse number 10. You have to eat the entire Korban Pesach. You can't leave anything over. And then in verse number 11, V'kacha tochlu oto. This is how you should eat it. Matnechem chagurim, na'alechem beraglechem, u'makelchem biyadchem. Pachaltem oto b'chipozon, Pesach hu Hashem. This is how you eat it. Loins girded, sandals on your feet, staff in your hand. Eat it hurriedly. It is a Passover offering to God. And Pesach. In other words, you're eating it, but you also have one foot out the door. You can't leave till you eat it. But the Torah makes it very clear that the Korban Pesach is a prerequisite. But the idea is that shortly after, you will be leaving Mitzrayim. And of course, the chapter 12 would describe the circumstances under which we leave Egypt. And we'll get to that. So this is clearly, the Torah is connecting the Korban Pesach. You're going to leave that night, but not until you first bring this offering, this Korban Pesach. So let me just say a few more words about the Korban Pesach, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions. So the Korban Pesach, above all, is a sacrifice. It's a korban. And when you look at what the Torah says about the Korban Pesach, it reminds us of many other sacrifices that are described in the Torah. I mean, the third book of the Torah, Vayikra, called Torah Kohanim, and it mentions many sacrifices. It doesn't mention the Korban Pesach, by the way, but it mentions other sacrifices. And when it comes to sacrifices, what the Torah says is what kind of animals are appropriate to bring as sacrifices, how old they are. So we have in the Korban Pesach, set tamim, that it's a lamb, or right, it could be a goat also. Sekvasim or yizim. It's 1 year old. That is to say, it's within the first year. And then we have the rule that it is to be eaten, but it can't be left over. You're not allowed to leave any of the sacrifice over. Right? Don't leave it till the morning, and what's left over in the morning has to be burned. And that's a rule that we encounter elsewhere in the Torah in general about sacrifices, that no sacrifices should be left over. It's called notar. And what is left over is burnt. So that's another rule that is related. We have that with sacrifices in general. And we have it right here with the Korban Pesach. And above all, we have something else about this Korban Pesach. And that is that the blood of the Korban is to be placed on the lintel and on the doorpost. There the Torah says that. Let's find that verse. That's in early in verse number 7. L'chu min adam v'natnu al shtei hamezuzot v'al hamashkot al habatim asher yochlu oto bahem. That's an important verse for us. So first of all, the blood is placed on the doorpost and on the lintel. Now, in all the other sacrifices, the blood is thrown on the altar, on the mizbeach. That's normally, and that is the critical act in bringing sacrifices, is the placing of the blood upon the altar. So normally there's an altar, and different sacrifices, the blood is thrown differently. Sometimes it's on the 4 corners of the altar, sometimes on 2 corners, sometimes just on once. But every sacrifice, the placing or the sprinkling of the blood is critical. And the Korban Pesach is no exception in that sense. But the difference is that in the Korban Pesach, there is no altar. There's no mizbeach. The blood is placed on the doorpost and on the lintel. And so, in other words, what it sounds like is that actually the doorpost and the lintel, or maybe one could say the house, the bayit, is actually the altar. One places the blood upon the house becomes the altar. And not only is the house the altar, but the Torah said, apart from the fact that the blood is placed on the house, the blood is placed on the house, asher yochlu oto bahem, in which the sacrifice shall be eaten. And that's another interesting feature of sacrifice in general. Sacrifice in general, depending on the kind of sacrifice, has a particular place in which you eat it. Sacrifices in general fall into two categories. There's what's Kodesh and Kodesh Kodashim, holy and very holy. So depending on whether it's Kodesh or Kodesh Kodashim, the space in which one eats it is limited. The most holy sacrifices that are eaten, the ones that are eaten within the temple precincts. The other sacrifices that are also holy can be eaten in a much larger space, say within Jerusalem generally. And there are all kinds of other rules. But no matter what kind of sacrifice you're talking about, it's confined to a certain space. In general, holiness is about confining, whether it's sacred time or whether it's sacred space. And the Korban Pesach is no exception in that sense. In fact, it fits right in with all the others. In the case of the Korban Pesach, the space in which you may eat it is only inside the house. You are not allowed to take the korban outside the house. So there's something about the house, actually. The house is a kind of cordoned off sacred space. So the house is both the altar, because the blood is thrown on the doorposts and on the lintel, but the house is also the sacred space. You must eat the sacrifice inside the house. You can't go outside. And that's a rule in general about sacrifices, including Korban Pesach. My point being, the Korban Pesach is a real korban. It's a korban inside your house. It's unusual in that respect, but it is actually a sacrifice. We can't emphasize that enough. That's a very important point. Next, I want to think about what it means to be a korban and the great significance of korban. We can't leave until we bring the sacrifice. So this is, some of the elements of this Korban Pesach. Let me stop here for a moment and take any comments or questions about anything I said so far, and then we'll try to go more deeply into the idea of this Korban Pesach. If anybody has comments, questions, or whatever.
David?
Yep.
Based on what you just said, we had said before that Hashem didn't speak to Moshe in Mitzrayim usually. That Mitzrayim was considered, a makom that had no kedusha at all. That was really a defiled place, and therefore he only spoke to him outside on 90% of the time, right?
Well, I didn't say that. That Rashi says that, and you're saying
okay.
it.
Okay.
I made a different point. I made the opposite point. Why mention Mitzrayim? Where else would God be talking?
Okay.
That was my point. It's the opposite point. But go ahead, continue.
Sorry. But based on that, it would seem that if we're trying to have the idea of cultivating the idea of importance of getting a sense of people and of family, that to differentiate between the outside and the inside, that the house is going to be so important as to differentiate as outside, that anything outside is non-Jewish, is non-Israelite. And only inside the house is it acceptable to eat the Korban Pesach. That would further heighten the contrast between, Bnei Israel and the outside nation, and strengthen their sense of identity.
That's true. I think the idea of having a cordoned off space is certainly
right.
Even within the land of Mitzrayim, in a sense, you are not in Mitzrayim. In a sense, you've
right.
cordoned off the space.
Right.
That is true. I just wanted to pick up on what you said and just to add something over here, which I think is a very important point about chapter 12. Yes, the focus is certainly the bayit. That's the point. The bayit is actually the altar. The bayit is the place in which the sacrifice is eaten. And not only that, the people that bring the sacrifices, in the very beginning of chapter 12, the Torah says, take for yourselves, ish, sel beit avot, sel bayit. Beit avot, the family brings the sacrifice. The Paschal sacrifice has to be eaten fully. So depending on the size of the animal, you need people to make sure that it's eaten fully. And the Torah actually raises the question, what will happen if you have a small family? If it's just a couple of people in the house, you're not allowed to leave anything over. And then the Torah says, if that be the case, you should join up with your neighbor. You should join up in verse 4, Mi'at habayit miyot miseh, u'akachu shcheno akarov beito b'michsat nefashot. Then you join in with your neighbor, and the sacrifice becomes a sacrifice not just of my family, but maybe me and my neighbor's family. Maybe there's 3 families. People join together. They join in one place. But the people who bring it, it's a sacrifice of the Beit Avot. So bayit appears both as a definition of who brings it, of where it's brought, and the space in which it's brought, and of course it's the altar. It's all of those things. What I wanted to add over here is the following. This is chapter 12 of the book of Exodus of Sefer Shemot. How does Sefer Shemot begin? Ela Shemot b'nei Yisrael habayim Mitzrayim et Yaakov ishu beito bo. We came down to Mitzrayim, says the Torah in the beginning of this book, each one with his bayit. But there the bayit means the family. Each family, Jacob's sons, all came down to Egypt. Each one had a bayit. But the bayit in chapter 1 is about family. Chapter 12, we're talking about becoming a people, not about family, but about peoplehood. But the Paschal sacrifice, to be more precise, is actually a transitional moment. Because on one hand, the Paschal sacrifice is brought by the individual family. That's clear. It's brought by each bayit. There's not one sacrifice for all the Jews. There are situations where there's one sacrifice for all the Jews. Korban Sibor, the tummy, the daily offerings in the temple, in the morning and the afternoon. There's one sacrifice in the morning, one in the afternoon for all of the people. It's called the Korban Sibor. The Korban Pesach is not that way. There's no one Korban Pesach. There are many Korban Pesachs. But on the other hand, everybody's doing it. So from one perspective, from a certain narrower perspective, I think it's a family sacrifice. But from a different perspective, it is a communal sacrifice. And remember, when Moshe spoke to Paro, and Paro said, okay, you can bring the sacrifice. Whom do you want to take with you? You can send the men, but not the women. You can send the old people, but not the young people. And Moshe said to him, no. Young and old, boys and girls, men and women, everybody's got to go. It's a festival for all of us. So there is, and the Korban Pesach, as I understand it, is that sacrifice that's brought in Mitzrayim. So on one hand, it's a sacrifice. Everybody has to be included. That's the point. You can't exclude anybody. On the other hand, it doesn't feel like a normal communal sacrifice. In fact, from the standpoint of the Talmud, if you had to define what is a Korban Pesach, is it a Korban Sibor or a Korban Yachid? The Korban Pesach is a Korban Yachid. There's no question about that. It's not a Korban Sibor. Everybody brings, every family brings, every group brings their own sacrifice. But it is a transitional moment. That's why it's so critical. This is the moment of transition from the bayit of chapter 1 to the bayit of chapter 12. And actually, if we think about Moshe's task in Egypt, what is Moshe's mission? Moshe's mission is to form a nation, and to form a nation which revolves around some ethical principles. That's the ideal. The primary one being God's servants, serving God, not serving Pharaoh, serving God and all that entails. And that's how the book will end, with a place of service, with the Mishkan. It's not limited to the Mishkan, obviously, but in the words of the Torah later, I will build me a sacred place. I will dwell amongst them. So the idea of the Mishkan is a kind of, I will dwell amongst them. I won't dwell in it. The idea is that the idea of the sacred space, that's what makes us a people, should be carried over to what we do outside the Mishkan. Now that's the goal. Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. That's clear. The nation of priests and a holy nation. That's the ideal. And that's always an aspiration. We never actually fully reach that, of course, but we aspire to that. So the Korban Pesach then, in terms of the bayit, remember, we always read these texts in light of the larger context, and that's the bayit, which begins the book, and that's Moshe's task. And as we know, to build a nation, to take people who don't necessarily, because people don't always get along with each other, and we know that Moshe's early experience in Egypt was he had to run away from Egypt, was to try to break up a fight, and one way or the other, they attack him, and soon afterwards, Pharaoh finds out what Moshe has done. He killed the Egyptian. He has to run away. So it's not a simple matter, and there will be complaints throughout the desert journey that we know. In fact, in the Torah readings in the synagogue nowadays, we read about the spies. We read about the previous week about the complainers. There's always complaints. Korach is next week. There are many complaints. It's not a simple matter, and Moshe's task is to teach people, to educate people that they're ready to take the next step. He himself won't enter the land, but his mission is to create this people. So the idea of the Korban Pesach then is to create this sense of community as a prerequisite. Okay, that was just a follow up on what Deborah was saying. Yeah.
And Rabbi Silber, this also is like the teaching moment when we tell children the table is like a mizbeach, we're respecting it. It's like really catapults into modern day, that teaching moment.
Right. The idea of the house being a mizbeach, by the way, which is very interesting. The idea of mizbeach in general, I mean, we'll come to this maybe a little later on, but the question is, let me come to it now, actually. Let me raise a different point about this Korban Pesach. The Torah makes it clear, you are to place the blood on the doorpost and on the lintel. And the Torah says in chapter 12 that you take the blood, in the verse number 13, okay? Verse 12, I will pass through the land of Egypt. That's verse number 12. Smiting of the firstborn. I will wreak vengeance or judgments against the gods of Egypt, whatever that means. Let's put that aside for now. And then in verse number 13, the blood will be a sign on the houses in which you are present, in which you are there, you dwell. I will see the blood. Let's leave that out for a moment. What does upasachti mean? I will be poseach, and there will be no plague to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Right? Later on, the Torah says that in verse number, it's even more striking, in verse number 23, chapter 12, verse 23. V'yavar Hashem l'gofet Mitzrayim, v'ra'at adam ala mashkov, v'yashtei hamzuzot, God will pass through Egypt and see the blood on the lintel doorpost. U'posach Hashem ala Pesach, and God will be poseach on the Pesach, on the door. This is v'lo yitain hamashchit lavo el batechem l'ngov, and will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses to plague you. That's what it says in verse 23. So what does Pasach mean then? This is the question. What does Pasach mean? We usually think of Passover, that God will skip over the house. God will destroy the other houses, the firstborn. The house will be plagued. But Pasach, ala Pesach, God will skip over, will pass over the house. However, when you read verse number 23, it doesn't sound that way, does it? It says, Pasach Hashem ala Petach, lo yitein la mashchit, lavo avotechem lingov. Yes, Luke says to hover. That's what it does sound like. And we have the word Pasach to be to hover in a different biblical text. Remember Elijah at Mount Carmel. You can't stand in two places, says Elijah. You have to choose. Is it Baal or is it God? Which one? It can't be poseach. So it's for verse 23, it sounds like actually the better word is not to skip over. No. There's a destroying angel traveling out throughout the land, but God will hover above the house. and God will not permit the destroyer to enter your house. That's what it sounds like. So the idea of the blood. Now let's go back to the blood on the blood on the door, the blood on the house. Okay, what is that about? So I think there are two ways to read this. One way is simply that the blood is a sign. Okay, it's a sign. It's a sign that this house is to be spared. It's a sign that one might even say, in conjunction with what I said earlier, this house is not part of Mitzrayim. This is a cordoned off space. It's a cordoned off space. That's one possibility. In conjunction with the idea of the cordoned off space, I'm reminded of what I myself said in the Passover Haggadah that we did. How many years ago? It's 12 years ago, I think, already 10, 12 years ago, a long time ago. And the Haggadah, and what I mean in the Haggadah is that in the drashot and the Seder, the last drasha on the word uvotot uvmoftim, and the uvmoftim, the Haggadah says uvmoftim is their hadam. The Moshe Namar dam va'esh v'timrot hashan. The last drasha at the Seder on the word moftim, in some Haggadah editions, it's in big print. It cites a verse from the book of Joel. Dam va'esh v'timrot hashan. And the verse from Joel, we have to look up the verses. And the point is that if you read the book of Joel, what it says is that at the end of days, God will reveal God's presence. Young people will prophesy, old people will dream. And then it says, but at the same time, God's presence will be very dangerous. And those that encounter God are in mortal danger. But those that flee to the sacred space will be spared. And the point that I made in the commentary on the Haggadah is that this last drasha, the idea that dam, right? Dam, that moftim is dam. But moftim is dam. It's blood. It's not referring to the blood of the plagues. It's referring to the blood put on the door. And the verse is that at the end of days, God's presence is dangerous. One cannot see me and live, says God. But there are ways to survive God's presence. And one way is by the cordoned off space. Those who enter into the sacred spaces will be safe. So that's one way to understand the dam. One way to understand the dam is it's a cordoning off of the sacred space. And the sacred space is a space of mercies, space of safety, etc. So that's one way to understand the dam. You know, I mean, I was a little kid, I was told, oh, because the angel can see the blood. So the angel, it's a son. The angel sees the blood, so the angel is not going to enter the house. It's a big sign, This is the house of the Israelites, whatever. That's one way to read it. But there is actually another way to read it, and I just wanted to make that suggestion. Then I'll be happy to hear comments or questions. And that is coming back to a different point, which is really the main focus I wanted to make over here, which is Korban Pesach. When you get down to the basics, is a sacrifice. It's a korban. Now, what is the idea of sacrifice? What is the idea of korban? So the Ramban, in his introduction to the book of Vayikra, in the very beginning, he makes the point about sacrifice. For the Ramban, fundamentally, the idea of sacrifice is the idea of substitution. In other words, among other things, let me put in my language. Among other things, how can one encounter God? How can finite human being, mortal human being, encounter the infinite and omnipotent God? Because the very encounter itself is in the Bible is dangerous. It's an ontological fact. It's also a psychological fact. How can one stand before the omnipotent God, the omniscient, omnipotent God? So what allows us to stand in God's presence, among other things, sometimes, is we are bringing something which is us. It's an act of substitution. And the best example of an act of substitution would be the book of Bereshit, chapter 22. Story that's very familiar to all of us, Akedat Yitzchak. Yitzchak, Avram is told to sacrifice Isaac. He was also told that through Isaac you shall be blessed. But he hears God's message and he accepts it. He's willing to go through with it. Maybe on some level he believes he won't have to, okay. But every act that he takes suggests he's going to do it. He binds him. And then the angel calls down from heaven, don't do it. Stay your hand, hold back your hand. And then Avram does hold back his hand, but the question remains in the Torah, and no doubt for Abraham, but God told me to bring him as a sacrifice. Now, there's a contradiction within God's own word. How do I resolve this contradiction? Sacrifice him, don't sacrifice him. And then Avram looks up and understands of his own. He's not told, but he figures it out. There must be some way that both statements can be true. That Isaac is sacrificed and not sacrificed at the same time. He picks up his eyes and he sees the ram entangled in the brush. And he understands. He brings it as a sacrifice instead of his son. So the idea of sacrifice is, in some sense, it's my proxy. In some sense, it is me. But of course, on the practical side, it's actually not me. So Isaac can survive the encounter, and God can be reconciled, as it were, through the medium of sacrifice, which is the medium of substitution. And that, I believe, is the deep teaching of the Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice. Because the Paschal sacrifice, it's not just a sign, it's not even just a safe space. I think it is those things, but there's something else. What God is saying is, I will pass through Egypt on that night. And those who are not ready for the encounter, those who are not worthy of the encounter, will be in danger, and in mortal danger. And that actually includes everybody. That includes the Egyptians, and frankly, it includes the Israelites as well, because when you think about the story of the Israelites in the land of Egypt, it's hard to say. I mean, yes, we did take that first step out of Mitzrayim. When you think about it, and given what happens afterwards and the constant complaining and the story of the spies, let's go back to Mitzrayim. It's hard to understand the story of Israel and Egypt as completely distinct and separate. There's an act of separation. There's trying to figure out who we are, etc. But from a certain perspective, it's the beginning of the journey. So what God is doing is, in the case of the Korban Pesach, is accepting, instead of us, God is taking a proxy. God is taking a substitute. So the idea of the Korban Pesach is the idea of a korban. It's the idea of an act of substitution, which doesn't, I think, contradict what I said before. I think it's both. I think it's both a sacred space, cordoned off space, but it's also an act of substitution. It's a korban. I want to make that point. I think that's a really important point about the Korban Pesach. And I want to make one last point, and I'll stop and take comments and questions, which is this, that the Korban Pesach is the necessary step that we take in order to leave Egypt. Korban Pesach, if we had to say what kind of sacrifice is it, there are different kinds of sacrifices. There are burnt offerings. There are two kinds of sin offerings. And then there's something called the Korban Shlamim, a goodwill offering. And the difference is that the Korban Shlamim is eaten by the ones who bring the sacrifice. The priest gets a piece of it, but the basic part of the Korban Shlamim, the part is burnt on the altar, that's to God. But the Korban Shlamim is eaten by the people that bring the sacrifice. The Korban Pesach, sometimes it's called the Zevach, or Shlamim, Zvachim and Shlamim. The Korban Pesach is the ultimate, actually, Korban Shlamim in the sense, it's the only sacrifice that we have in the Bible where the priests get nothing. The priests don't get anything here. It's only God gets a part, of course, and the blood. But the sacrifice is eaten by those that have come together to join in the Paschal sacrifice. Now, I mention this because of the following point. We think of the Korban Pesach as a Korban Shlamim. It reminds me of a previous Korban Shlamim that we have in the Torah. Where do we have a Korban Shlamim in the Chumash? Before this, because the laws of sacrifices come later. But yet there is a Korban Shlamim in the Torah. Anybody remember? It's very striking, actually.
Avram.
So Avram brings an Olah. Avram, Yitzchak is to be a burnt offering. Haleu Shamli Olah. Noah also brought an Olah. Cain and Hevel brought a Mincha. There are sacrifice, by the way, like it or don't like it, sacrifice is critical to the Chumash. In fact, the matter is, it's one of the 6 Sidrei Mishnah as well. Sacrifice is very basic, but there is one person who brings a Korban Shlamim. It's Jacob. And when does Yaakov bring the Korban Shlamim? Remember when he brought it? He brings it when he's going down to Egypt. In chapter 46, he's going to meet his son Joseph in Egypt, and he's concerned about going to Mitzrayim, leaving the land, and he has a sense that going to Egypt might not be a short visit to Egypt. Vayizbach zvachim le'Elohei aviv Yitzchak, and he brought zvachim to the God of his father Isaac. In other words, it's interesting that on the way down to Egypt, he brings sacrifices. But what is that actually about? There are 2 questions. Why does he bring sacrifices? And secondly, why this kind of sacrifice? Why is Yaakov bringing the carbons, the zvachim, the shlamim? Abraham brought an olah. Noah brought an olah. Cain and Hevel mincha. And what Hevel brought exactly is not clear, but it sounds like a mincha of sorts, some kind of sacrifice. But Yaakov brings zvachim. And I would say 2 things about Yaakov. Yes.
David, it's Sandra. Could it be that it's part of the protective mode that you were alluding to before? That the hovering, the Pesach nature of this particular Bayit Korban was protective, and that if in fact Yaakov is bringing the zevach before going to Mitzrayim, it's almost like an amulet. So maybe it's an invocation of God's protection starting out, because we know that he's afraid. Journey's frightened Jacob.
Yes, he is afraid. It says explicitly he's afraid. Yeah. Right.
So I mean, and we know from the history of what the Chumash tells us that he was terrified when he left his parents' house. Right. And he slept out in the open. He's terrified leaving his house. He's terrified about what he's going to encounter. I mean, right. So maybe I'm just trying to explore this and pick up on your notion of emphasizing that that it was the Pesach, the Pesachim part of it, of the Zevach.
Well, I think that the truth of the matter is that that's not what I had in mind, but it's an excellent point. I have to remember what you said. It's an excellent point, actually. In other words, what you're doing is reading. In other words, after we read the Korban Pesach, then we go back to that story, because that's the story. That's when Egypt begins in that story. Jacob's going down to Egypt, taking all his possessions. He's going down there to live in Mitzrayim, and he's very frightened, of course. And perhaps in light of the Korban Pesach, one can see the sacrifice as a call for divine protection. I think that's a very, very interesting point. A very good point. Thank you for that. I actually agree with. I hear it. It's very interesting. I had 2 other thoughts about the Zvachim. One is that actually I believe, I mean, it's possible that sometimes in the book on Shmuel, I make this point actually, that sometimes you bring sacrifices. It wouldn't explain dafka why shlamim, but sometimes you bring sacrifices because through the sacrifice, you want to connect to God. You want to hear God's voice. But the best example of this is in the story that we're going to read soon in the synagogue, the story of Bilam. When Bilam is told to curse Israel, and Bilam wants to hear God's voice, what does Bilam do? He brings a set of sacrifices each time. He brings a whole bunch of sacrifices. And the idea of the sacrifice there sounds like I'm going to bring the sacrifices to connect to God, and maybe God will then reveal God to me, and will hopefully give me a way to curse Israel. It doesn't work out exactly that way for him, but God does reveal God's presence to Bilam, and God does give a message to Bilam, not of cursing, but of blessing. Okay, so I thought that Yaakov, on the way down, he's very concerned about this because he knows he once before he went into exile with rather unhappy consequences. He left Beersheba and went to the house of Lavan. Now he's leaving Beersheba to go to Mitzrayim. What's the story? So perhaps the sacrifice, in general, sacrifice is a way to get God's attention. That's on one level. But the thought I really wanted to put forward over here is why dafka the carbon shlamim? Why dafka the zvachim? And I think what you have in the carbon Pesach is that the carbon shlamim, more than any other sacrifice, lends itself by its very nature to a kind of communal sacrifice. Because in the carbon shlamim, especially the carbon Pesach, because the carbon Pesach, the participants eat the carbon Pesach. In fact, the carbon Pesach is unique in this sense, at least the way the Talmud understands it. Because all the other sacrifices, you bring the sacrifices, you burn part on the altar, and some sacrifices are actually eaten. But the eating of the sacrifice and all the other sacrifices is always secondary. Let's say you have a sacrifice and nobody eats it. For whatever reason, the people couldn't eat it. The sacrifice is still kosher. It's a kosher sacrifice, but okay, it wasn't carried out the best way, but the sacrifice is kosher. The carbon Pesach is different. The carbon Pesach is all about eating the sacrifice. The emphasis in the Chumash is on the eating. And eating is a communal act. Eating is a social and a communal act. And when Jacob's going down to Mitzrayim, his concern is not for himself. He's going down with his whole family. And this family, in the first verse of Shemot, it repeats it. Jacob went down, Ishu Beito Bo. He's taking the whole family with him. His concern is not Jacob himself. He's an old man. He's not worried about himself. He's concerned about the next generation. And therefore, he brings Zvachim. He brings a Zevach, which is a Shlamim, to the God of his father Isaac. But I think it is interesting that the introduction to Mitzrayim is with the Zevach, and the leaving of Mitzrayim is with the Zevach. Martem Zevach Pesach. So there's a framing over here. It begins and ends with the sacrifice. Okay, let me stop here for a moment.
Silber,
yes, please, speak up.
Just returning to an earlier point that you made, perhaps underlining it. Usually when we think of a creation of a people, we would think of a dramatic act like the Har Sinai or the French Revolution or any of the other revolutions, which are mass acts where suddenly people break down the boundaries that had bound them, separated them from each other. But it's interesting that here, the formation of the Jewish people is in the bias first, the ethical basis of accepting God's yoke, and then comes Kabbalah Satira and the mass unison formation of a people.
Yeah, let me just pick up on the point that you made, which I think is an interesting point. Again, these stories we're reading chapter 12. Looking at chapter 12. Chapter 12 is the 12th chapter of this book. I mean, the book of Exodus is a book. It's connected to the other books of the Torah, but it's one of my critiques I have of the way that the Torah is taught in our schools. This is my main. I've had this critique for many, many years. Is that let's think of the book of Exodus as a book. It's a book. This particular book is 40 chapters. I've never encountered in my life, let's say high schools. So even in elementary, but high schools, let's say, in English, they're going to study a few books. Things they carry, whatever books they're going to. Have you ever heard of a teacher saying, well, class, we're doing Crime and Punishment this semester. We're going to study the first 100 pages. I've yet to hear that. Anybody suggesting, someone who said that, you say, well, you out of your mind? Is that what? 100 pages? We got to read the book. Doesn't mean we're going to look at every page, but first of all, let's read the book. What's the book about? It's only when it comes to the Chumash or something. And I'm not saying we have to read the book in one semester, but the idea of reading the first 6 chapters and then next year skipping to the first 6 chapters of the next book, does that make any sense to anybody? I can never imagine that makes the slightest bit of sense. because you won't understand the 6 chapters either, by the way, because the book has themes, has motifs that carry through. And coming back to the point that I mentioned this now, because the question is, what is this book about? The Ramban, and I think this is a very plausible point. The Ramban makes the point to Laszlo's point. The Ramban makes the point that the goal of the book of Exodus is to be a holy people, and a holy people requires a holy space, and to build a space for God around which we dwell. The fact of the matter is that 12 chapters in this book out of 40 are dedicated to the instruction to build the Mishkan and the building of the Mishkan. And that's how the book ends. The book ends with the Mishkan. So the Ramban says the idea of the book in terms of creating a people, a nation, it's what God said to Moshe before Har Sinai. Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. That's the aspiration, to be a holy people, a nation of priests, etc. And that's where the book ends. So from that, if you think about it in that way, it makes perfect sense to start with Korban Pesach, because the book's going to end with sacrifice. It's a place of sacrifice. It's a place of service. It's a place of avoda. So what makes more sense than the first mitzvah connects to the last mitzvah? It's exactly, yes, of course it's true that along the way we also receive instructions. We stand at Sinai and we receive those instructions, but the Ramban says, as important as Har Sinai is, and believe me, the Ramban will be the last person on the face of the earth to deny the importance of Torah and the study of Torah. It's one of the all-time greats. I mean, you're talking about, beyond words, but the Ramban says that's not the end. In fact, the Ramban says you can keep the whole Torah and not be a good person. You can be a naval b'shut haTorah. So the Torah is a means to an end for the Ramban, but the goal is the Mishkan. And from that perspective, if you think about it, starting with the Paschal sacrifice makes total sense, actually. Because at the end of the day, it's what this is what it's about. It's about service. It's about avoda. It's about creating sacred spaces. So the Paschal sacrifice is a mini sacred space, and the end of the book is the sacred space for the entire community. So the Paschal sacrifice would be one step towards the creation of a sacred space in which God can dwell through the sacred space to dwell amongst the people. I would add one other point over here, which I don't want to get into now, but something very interesting. This is chapter 12. And beginning in chapter 25, with the golden calf sort of interrupted between the instruction to build and the building, we have the golden calf, of course. But actually, in thinking about this process of moving towards the sacred space, there's another story I want to put out there, which has elements of sacrifice, and which is a critical story in the book of Exodus, and that's the story of the man. We'll see the man is food, but it's not any old food. When we look at the man, in the Chumash and the rabbinic tradition understood this very well, that the man has an aspect of sacrifice. You're not just eating food. You're eating, in a sense, it's sacrificial food. It carries with it some of the elements of sacrifice. For example, I'll give you one example where it's clear. When it comes to the Korban Pesach, one of the things, I mentioned this, and when you read through it again, it's obvious that what the Torah emphasizes with the Korban Pesach and with every sacrifice, you can't leave it over. You have to eat the entire sacrifice. And therefore, you see how big the animal is, and you make sure you have enough people who will eat the sacrifice, that the sacrifice is holy, it's been consecrated, so you don't want it to be left over and go to waste. You want it to be fully eaten. You don't want any waste. When it comes to the man, you can't leave it over, actually. You have to eat it in its appropriate time. If you try to leave it over to the next day, it's going to spoil. I mean, that's one example. And to think about the man in a different sense, think about the man as sort of a precursor to the Mishkan. I think when we get to the man, which is a really important story, and it appears not only in Exodus, it appears again in Bamidbar, so that's a critical story. We have to think of it in those terms as well.
The sacrifice is their independence. I mean, so far, on a certain level.
Yes, of course, yes, that's for sure. I mean, we're sacrificing. It's what God says. So the gods of I will wreak judgment upon the gods of Egypt. So and as we discussed in the past, the plagues are directed to some extent against the gods of Egypt. The first plague is against the Nile. is the god of Egypt. There are two main gods in Egypt, the god of the Nile, and of course the main god being the sun god. So the first god is against the god of the Nile, and the ninth plague is darkness, Ra. In fact, the Torah even plays with the word Ra. That's the name of the Egyptian sun god, is Ra. And the Torah will play with the word Ra, so for sure. And the idea of, and the Egyptians had many, many gods. I read they had hundreds of gods, actually. And the point is that, but we have one. And the idea of cordoning off our own space, and our God has different rules. As we go through the whole book, we'll see. Being a servant of, being Pharaoh's slave or being God's servant are not the same thing, because God has different rules. The way you serve is very different. That's one of the main foci we will get to later on. Who
Rabbi
else? Someone
Silber.
else? Leah, you want to say something?
Yes,
Go ahead.
it was much easier at Maharat when we were like a
Yes.
small little group.
Okay,
But
go ahead,
no,
speak up.
this is wonderful. I wanted to say that when you showed the beginning of Shemot, I didn't connect it until today of when they're enslaved, they've lost family. You've lost that sense of family. Families are being destroyed. And it's more than just, I will not destroy you, but I will bring you together as a family, because you have to eat that Korban Pesach as a family. And that's it. And yes, you're right. You have to become a people, but before you become a people, you start with the family. And that struck me as something very
Right, that's an excellent point. And I would say that, just to pick up on your point, just to extend it a little, I totally agree. And I think that if we think about what's happened till chapter 12, what Paro's MO was, what Paro tries to do is to divide, is to divide the people. Paro tries to turn the people against Moshe. Paro tries to turn the people against the Hebrew people in charge, because they get beaten. He tries to divide. Some can go, some can't go. You can take the men, but not the women. Take the young, but not take the old, but not the young. That Paro's whole approach, he understands when the people don't have unity, they're divided, fighting with each other, that will weaken them, weakens their resolve, and it makes them very, and the idea of them coming together with the carbon. So Moshe said to Paro, all of us have to go, and the idea of the bayit, it touches on the point that I made before, which is we came down as a bayit. At the end of the day, at the end of the Sefer Bereshit, okay, Joseph and the brothers on some level seem to be reconciled. I'm not saying it's 100%, but they seem to be reconciled. Jacob comes down with the whole family. They've brought all of their possessions. Joseph enables them to live together in the land of Goshen. Paro doesn't want that. Paro wants them divided throughout the land, but Joseph succeeds. So this question of, I think it's a very good point you're making, the question of, can we be one people with all our divisions? Because no two people think alike, and there are 12 different tribes, and we understand all that and all the tensions. But can we still find a way to come together? So the idea of the Korban Pesach, of having the bayit, and what the Torah said, if you're not enough in your bayit, you join with the next bayit, right? The idea of, and actually, slaves can't really have that, because a slave doesn't have a full identity. It's very hard for a slave, for many reasons, to form a kind of community. So Moshe's task, which he accepted, I mean, God twisted his arm, but Moshe accepts it, is to build the nation. And part of the Korban Pesach is to find something that can unite the people. There are many disagreements, but on the core things, can we find ways for people to come together? And I think the Korban Pesach is the example. We're coming together. We are God's servants. We're not Pharaoh's servants anymore. We're going to be God's servants. We're avoda. We're not avdei paro. That's the aspiration. But as we know the story, a part of us always wants to go back to Egypt, because even though you're a slave, but you sort of know what you're getting, and you have to take responsibility. So freedom comes with kind of insecurity. Freedom comes with its challenges. And that's the story of the Chumash. So your point about the Korban Pesach, within the context certainly of these first 12 chapters, is a very important point. Again, we're not going through every detail of the Korban Pesach. I'm not going to do that here, but I did want to talk sort of generally speaking about why this Korban Pesach is really, it's really the critical moment. And without a Korban Pesach, we can't leave, and the Korban Pesach allows us to leave. Let me make one last point. Yes.
Is there a possibility also the allusion to what you said in Vayizbach when Yaakov said Vayizbach Zvachim leElohei Aviv Yitzchak? He's also alluding to the constant sense of the potential of the mashchit. The mashchit is always there. Yaakov is very sensitive to the potential for whether it's Esav or Lavan or whatever mashchit of the moment, who's always hovering there, and that partially colors his entire life. So he's very worried. So we're finding a continual way of saving the family from the ongoing mashchit that God can be.
Right. I would say also in terms of Vayizbach Zvachim leElohei Aviv, which is very striking. It should say he brought sacrifices to God. He brings sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And I think that when we think about the story of Yaakov in the book of Bereshit, I mean, the story that comes to mind is when Yaakov takes the blessing and Yaakov tricks his blind father. His father then sends him away. And I think Yaakov going down to Mitzrayim at this moment when he wants to go down as already the beginnings of peoplehood, with that sacrifice, a sacrifice for the whole family, I think that Yaakov himself may be understanding we have to connect not just to the future, we have to connect to the past. And therefore he's connecting to his father Isaac. His father Isaac, if he was there when Isaac dies, but he has to run away after he takes the blessings, and he wants to reconnect to his father there. So the part of being a community then, in light of what Chaim is suggesting, is not just to connect to the future. Part of a community is to see ourselves as continuing the past, operating within those traditions, understanding that we live in a different world. That's the challenge of connecting to the past, but connecting to the past in a real way. Because we're not living in the past. We're not living in Poland of 100 years ago. Most of us are living in the United States of America. Has its own challenges, many challenges. But the idea of living in really where we are, wherever that may be, whether it's here, Israel, wherever, it doesn't matter. But the idea that on one hand, we're living in the present, but Samuel, we want to honor the past, and we want to see ourselves as a continuation of the past. So at that very moment when Yaakov is going down to Mitzrayim, and Yaakov knows, he knows that this is the beginning of the exile. And God says, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to protect you. But Yaakov wants to affirm, I think, both his connections to the past and also through the communal sacrifice of the Shlomim, of the Zvachim, he wants to bring a sacrifice for all of his children. And understanding that the challenge will be in Mitzrayim, can we retain our identity when we're living in a different culture, and a culture that is antithetical in many ways to Jewish values? That's really the challenge. The Medrash says, it's not in the text, but the Medrash says, "V'chamushim olu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim." When Chamushim, the famous Medrash, only 1/5 left. 80% didn't get out. 80% were assimilated and were lost. So the Medrash, I mean, it's not the pshat, but the Medrash is well aware of the fact that living in Egypt for a couple of 100 years, you become part of that culture. And the Egyptian culture, from the Torah's standpoint, and God's commands are mutually exclusive. K'masei eretz Mitzrayim lo tasu, the Torah says. You can't live that way. Whatever you think of them, but you can't live that way. It's not your path. So I think that Yaakov, in that critical moment of going down to Mitzrayim, it's a critical moment. He's both connecting to his past and also he's thinking about and concerned about the future. Okay, I think we'll have to stop at this point then. By the way, as I said in the outset, that usually these weeks there's no classes, but I really felt that we're in the middle of something. I'd like to continue it, and we're going to have 4 more classes, and we're going to continue. We look to the Korban Paschal, not every verse, but I would like to get through these sections. And what's interesting about these chapters, chapter 12, 13, 14, and 15, is that here we have, and I'll talk about this next week, you have a story. We have the story of the Exodus, but in these chapters, we have all kinds of halachic sections. We have all kinds of rules and regulations. We have the Korban Pesach, we're going to have other mitzvot as well. And the integration of the mitzvot into the narrative is particularly striking over here. First time we really encounter this. So I wanted to pick up on some of that next time as we move forward. If anybody has any comments or questions, you can always email me, dsilber@drisha.org. Anyway, good to be together with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.